Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me on this lovely, bright February afternoon, and happy Black History Month. I hope it's been a restorative, insightful, celebratory, and reflective month for you, but of course, year round as well, as this is also just the beginning of your journey, I'm sure. Thank you all wellness watchers who have been here before for coming back and tuning into your wellness. You are so very welcome. And also thank you for our new wellness watchers that are joining us for the first time, whether you are watching this live or recorded, you are also so very welcome. My name is Cassandra Francis, and I am the founder as well as a clinic director and one of the registered psychotherapists at One Piece Therapy. And today we'll be talking about the mental cost of being strong, in particular, burnout survival mode and how to actually rest. So I found it was quite timely to talk about this as we are in the month of February in Black History Month because historically, Black people have gone through a lot, which is not a secret at all. And I find that whether it's in the month of February, it's heightened, or as a lifestyle, it's heightened, it's often underestimated what burnout and living in survival mode can actually do for the body. And rest, although appreciated, glamorized, spread across all social media platforms on how to do it, i.e., self care, it's also not necessarily understood nor integrated into our day to day because of who we understand ourselves to be, right? Whether Black History Month for you is a period of celebration, and therefore maybe you're doing many things personally or professionally, or maybe Black History Month for you is a moment of reflection of what our ancestors went through. So maybe more not necessarily solitude, but searching for that ground, that foundation, those roots can also evoke many other intense or heavy emotions. And therefore, burnout can be, something at our fingertips as we navigate this period of time and our lives in general. So very timely to talk about this topic. As usual, for those that have attended before, you know how I love to do it. Please engage with me, whether you're attending live and using the chat function or unmuting yourself, or if you're watching the recorded version and you're using the comment section, please engage me with some comments, questions, insight even, and we'll spend our time together. So let's get into it. Here's the agenda for today. So it's quite full as it usually is, which is why I say to engage as things come up for you. I am going to ask a couple of questions between time, but again, even before those prompts, feel free to use the chat function, or of course the comment section is yours, to feel free to access. So some of what we discuss, it may resonate deeply. And if you notice there's activation in your body, maybe some tightness, shallow breathing, or emotional intensity, please note that is not weakness. That is your nervous system doing its job, which is all of what we are going to be talking about, since that is directly related to burnout and survival mode. Be mindful of how your body is communicating with you as we are going through this webinar this afternoon. But ultimately, we'll go through an introduction, more so me sharing more of myself, as I know not everyone loves the icebreaker. So it's not group therapy. So there's no need to really share about yourself, but definitely I want to share more of who I am. And going through redefining strength, understanding survival mode, understanding burnout, and why rest feels so hard, but also how to exit survival mode. And by that, the integration and reflection part will be giving you a lot of different tools or different methods, maybe what you already do, but not applying it to exactly what you need. So we'll go through that. And at the last part here, you see questions, but again, feel free to ask as it appears for you. Okay, so introduction. So as I mentioned, and on the first slide, it was nicely displayed. So I am the founder of One Piece Therapy, as well as the clinic director and one of the registered psychotherapists. I'm also a clinical supervisor, a group facilitator, and a trauma informed yoga practitioner. So I wear a lot of hats. I love advocating for mental health, especially for Black people, especially for people of color at large, so the BIPOC community, as I find we know when we're not feeling good, but there's been so much cultural messages embedded in either our DNA, our bodies, our minds, our lifestyles, our cultures at large, that we kind of not even kind of we dismiss or minimize the symptoms of our body. So I find a lot of passion in supporting my people and people of color. And with that, I support individuals, couples, and groups, both virtually and in person. I presently support individuals ages 16 and older. So when it comes to my approaches with clients, I typically use emotion-focused therapy, which is what I will be integrating in today's webinar, as well as narrative therapy, gestalt therapy, psychodynamic therapy, a bit of techniques from CBT and ACT. However, I predominantly use the other methods, including trauma-informed care, antidepressive, so strength-based approaches, as well as culturally sensitive approaches. So there's a lot of, again, different modalities that I use to integrate into my work with clients, because I find that not one modality fits not even just one client, but even one concern with a client. And we're so multifaceted and dynamic, and especially when we're talking the holistic approach, which is also my foundation of supporting clients, I tap into the different parts of someone. So whether it's, of course, their mental health, physical health, spiritual, even career, just whatever makes you you is ultimately what I love to bring together into my work with clients. And that is a bit about who I am. Now, let's get into more of this webinar. So, redefining strength. I placed here that you are strong regardless of how hard you fight, because again, strength in the Black community in particular seems to be, the hardships that you have overcome. But we need to redefine it, because we don't necessarily have to live in that state of continuously conquering hardships. But of course, we can conquer. We are conquerors, but that's not a way to live. So redefining it. So cultural narratives around strength, such as endurance, self-sacrifice, or emotional suppression, is often defined as strength, right? So when you can endure hardships, you're strong. When you sacrifice your well-being for, let's do a few more hours at work, or let's tolerate this prejudice or discrimination in this environment, because who knows? There's so many becauses. Or this emotional suppression. It's almost this stoic nature of, don't show someone that you're sad. Don't show someone that you're mad. Don't cry. These cultural narratives have been surrounding the definition of strength. As I mentioned with emotion-focused therapy, which is my one of my main approaches to therapy, it reminds us that emotions are adaptive signals and not liabilities. Right. So as I share the cultural narratives, and even some of you in the chat are addressing right now, the cultural narratives around strength ultimately suppresses any bodily response to a stimuli or any emotional reaction to a trigger. Whereas emotion focused therapy is all about using those signals from our body to understand how to proceed in that certain context or that specific context. So it's not a liability, it's very much so useful information that our body naturally tells us. So with that, I must say, it's important to identify the difference between adaptive and chronic strength. So adaptive is more of a healthy, context appropriate response to a real threat. So it protects and mobilizes and resolves. Chronic strength is more suppressing the primary emotions such as fear, sadness, hurt, or anger long after the threat has passed. And this drives secondary stage, which can then be irritability, numbness, sometimes anger, depending on the primary emotion. And there's a lot of language. I'm actually becoming aware of the amount of language that I might be using. So if you have any questions, please feel free, because in this context of chronic strength, there are primary and secondary emotions. And primary emotions tends to be what we innately feel. So those are the adaptive emotions that our body signals us. We feel fear, we feel sadness, we feel hurt. And the secondary emotions tend to be what we feel in response to our primary. So if it feels too overwhelming or vulnerable to express hurt or fear, or even, again, sometimes anger, depending if our boundaries were crossed, then the secondary, when it comes to this context, we're calling it states. EFT, we call it emotions. And it covers up how we initially feel, right, in order to protect ourselves, which again, the examples I shared was irritability, numbness, or anger. Okay. So one example of this can be, I feel overwhelmed. That could be how it starts, but then that can easily become, I'm just tired of everyone, right? Let me just check out and go about my business. EFT, it suggests that emotions are adaptive signals. So chronic suppression of primary emotions, such as, again, fear, sadness, or hurt, leads to secondary emotions such as irritability, numbness, and anger, which is where we often operate from when we're experiencing burnout. And it's important to also note here that strength is adaptive under threat and harmful when it prevents processing of emotional experiences. Okay. So let's understand survival mode a bit. And I say let's stay here temporarily because not on the topic itself, there's a lot I'm about to cover, but on the sole fact that being in survival mode is meant to be a temporary state of being and not a lifestyle or part of your identity. So let's just stay here temporarily. So what is survival mode? So survival mode is chronic sympathetic activation, or also known as a dorsal collapse. And your nervous system would tend to be stuck in a threat response long after the danger has passed. So to clarify a bit more, let me know if I'm getting too sciencey as well. Yeah, let me know, because we're going to talk a lot about the nervous system. So in terms of the sympathetic nervous system, as you see here, it's about the fight or flight. So the sympathetic nervous system is part of the autonomic nervous system, and that this triggers a fight or flight response, which prepares the body for action, for danger or stress, such as an increased heart rate or goosebumps, for example. In opposition, the parasympathetic nervous system, which might sound a bit familiar to others, especially if you're really tapped into your meditation and yoga vibes, this returns the body back to calm and a state of rest and digest functions. So slowing down the heart rate and promoting energy storage. Both are part of the autonomic nervous system, which helps maintain the body's balance, such as a homeostasis, or not such as, the definition of homeostasis. But when we're experiencing survival mode, we are only or predominantly, I should say, activating the sympathetic nervous system. So that is either fight or flight or shut down. And this is to also, I also want to include here that because our body is responding naturally to our stimuli, our environment, we're not exactly choosing, okay, parasympathetic activate, or fight or flight activate, shut down, activate. It's our body naturally responding by trying to protect us, right? So it's very much so our subconscious, our nervous system that is controlling the survival mode. Of course, our coping would enhance how long we stay in this state, but the activation of this is not a conscious decision. So I'm saying this to already begin to lessen the judgment that some are speaking about or possibly thinking about. And as you see here, the ventral vagal, we can't forget the good. So this is about connection and safety, all relating to our nervous system. So let's talk a bit more about the biological stress pathways, where really understanding our nervous system is very crucial to learning your signs of burnout, your signs of survival mode, and your signs of when rest is actually needed. I do want to say, too, as a disclaimer, that the arrows on this slide are not exactly in order of what happens when our body is responding to a trigger, which is, again, stress. But this is the best illustration that I could find to show that they all relate to each other. So when the brain perceives a threat, such as physical, emotional, or social, it activates a tightly connected network involving the amygdala, which is our emotion center. That's the threat detection, where everything starts from that position. And then the hypothalamus, which is more of the command center, the HPA axis, which is the hormonal stress release response, which here is a cortisol elevation. Then the sympathetic nervous system, which is the adrenaline release, and then the prefrontal cortex, which is where the regulation and decision making happens. And these systems, they operate in loops and not in straight lines. So again, the arrows are not accurate, but the relatability, the interconnectedness is definitely accurate. So let's start with the amygdala. So this is the threat detection system. And this is ultimately first ignited when there is a trigger. So there's an increase in amygdala vigilance. And as I mentioned before, it is the emotion center of the brain. So amygdala specifically is part of the limbic system and functions as a rapid threat scanner. So it detects potential danger, whether it's real or perceived. It also activates before conscious thought. So our bodies are continuously responding to our environments before our mind understands what's going on. However, at this point, it then sends distress signals to the hypothalamus, which we'll get into shortly. So under chronic stress, the amygdala becomes more reactive. It lowers the threshold for threat detection, and neutral events can trigger stress responses. So this is often described as hypervigilance. When it comes to the next step, so once our amygdala is activated, then we have an immediate sympathetic activation, right? So that adrenaline release. So once the amygdala signals danger, the hypothalamus activates the sympathetic nervous system. This triggers the adrenaline and norepinephrine. I say norepinephrine. I hope I said that right. Increasing the heart rate, rapid breathing, and also just heightened alertness and many other triggers that might sound familiar to you. And this response happens within seconds. Okay, so ultimately preparing the body for immediate fight or flight. So now the blood is starting to flow a bit more to the large muscles as well. It's important to note here that adrenaline, as I'm sure you know in other contexts, it acts quickly and also can dissipate relatively quickly unless the threat signal persists, again, whether perceived or actual. Then, after the SNS is activated, we get into the HPA axis activation, so the cortisol elevation. Okay. And this happens where the hypothalamus releases the CRH hormone, and then the pituitary releases the ACTH hormone, and then the adrenal cortex releases cortisol. So it's more of the third step, even though it's the main hormone when it comes to, again, burnout, stress, and survival mode. This process takes more minutes rather than seconds to activate. And the cortisol's role, so that's the stress hormone's role, it maintains blood sugar for energy. It suppresses non-essential functions like digestion, reproduction, or immune responses. Because again, we're preparing for fight or flight, we're preparing for danger, we're preparing for a battle or war. So we're not going to think, okay, I got to eat right now. Right? Our body is saying we have other things to do, which is often why a lot of clients can say that they don't feel hungry when they're stressed, as much as some do. The ones that say they don't, like your digestive system probably shut down. Not even probably, it does shut down completely. And even immune responses can shut down because now that's not the battle to fight. Like, it's not against sickness, it's against the perceived or actual external threat of your environment. So cortisol also sustains alertness and modulates inflammation as well. So I do want to emphasize that cortisol is not bad. It is essential for survival, but the issue, again, is in the chronic elevation of it. As we all, if not experienced, we've probably seen our parents, who most of our parents are immigrants, they've gone, or even parents, people, but let's honoring our parents that are immigrants, they've really gone through a lot of stress to set themselves up the way they feel they need to be, the family needs to be, we need to be. And therefore, we see an elevation of stress and how stress can harm the body. Stress literally can kill the body. And it's important to note that anything in excess is never good. However, it exists for a reason, because we do also need it for survival. Now, once cortisol is activated, it reduces our prefrontal cortex regulation. Okay, and our prefrontal cortex is responsible for executive functioning, impulse control, emotion regulation, perspective taking, decision making, all the rationale that we like to access. So under acute stress, the blood flow shifts away from the prefrontal cortex towards survival mode circuits. Right now, the blood has to go somewhere else because it has to prepare for other behavioral protections than the mind perceptions. Then the amygdala becomes dominant as well, and rational thinking temporarily decreases. And that's under acute stress. Under chronic cortisol exposure, the functional connectivity weakens completely and emotional regulation becomes more difficult. So this is why people in prolonged stress states may say that I know better, but I can't think clearly, or overreacted even when I didn't want to, right? It's neurobiological more than a weakness, and that something is actually wrong with you. Again, as I mentioned, I keep reiterating it in case I'm losing anyone. I know I said a lot, so feel free to ask questions. But these all communicate with each other differently than the arrows you see on the slide. Okay, so how do these systems communicate, ultimately creating a feedback loop? So as I mentioned, the first loop, which is the amygdala to the HPA axis, So the cortisol is supposed to signal back to the brain to shut down the stress response. So this is the negative feedback loop. In chronic stress, the feedback loop becomes dysregulated, cortisol receptors may become less sensitive, and the shutdown signal weakens, and the system says stay on. Another loop is the amygdala to the prefrontal cortex. So in a regulated system, the prefrontal cortex inhibits amygdala reactivity, and it says we are safe, stand down. In chronic stress, the amygdala activity increases, the prefrontal cortex regulation decreases, and the amygdala overrides the rational assessment. So this creates emotional reactivity, irritability, difficulty feeling safe, and heightened startle response, which is what we'll get more into shortly. Loop 3 is cortisol to the brain structure. So chronic elevated cortisol increases, again, the amygdala sensitivity. It reduces the prefrontal cortex functioning, and it impacts our memory, consolidation, and contextual safety. So the memory portion is, I'm introducing a new word, or maybe a familiar word, but new in today's webinar, the hippocampus. So this normally helps us distinguish, this reminds me of danger versus this is actual danger, right? So when cortisol is chronically elevated, the context processing weakens and the threat generalization increases. So this is why past stress can bleed into present perception as well. So what survival mode ultimately looks like is the amygdala scans and over-detects threat. The adrenaline prepares the body for immediate action. Cortisol sustains alertness and energy. The prefrontal cortex loses regulatory strength, and the feedback loops fail to shut the system down. So you're constantly activated in the fight or flight response. As a result, there can be burnout. You would stay in survival mode for longer than helpful. There's hypervigilance, there is fatigue or wired feeling, emotional dysregulation, cognitive fog, and much more. It's also important to note that the system is not malfunctioning, but it is over adapting. And as you can imagine, anything that works over time typically becomes more exhausted and doesn't flow as appropriately than if it's just flowing in its natural state. And why does this matter exactly? I'm sure you can, well, I hope you can gain some insight already of why this matters. But I want to share this understanding of biology to reduce the shame, right? To shift the language from what's wrong with me to what happened to my nervous system, right? Ultimately reinforcing, planting the seed that rest and regulation are physiological necessities and not indulgences, okay? You already deserve rest because your body needs rest, right? It's not something you have to earn. It's not something you have to fight for. It is literally a biological and birthright to have periods of rest, especially after an intense activation of your sympathetic nervous system. Feel free to ask questions as they appear. Okay? So signs that you're living in survival mode. If the internal workings of biology is all mumbo jumbo, here are the concrete signs that we tend to comprehend, right? And I also do want to add too that these are adaptations and they're not character flaws. The nervous system learns these patterns to keep you safe, okay? And they can also happen simultaneously, although some may be more evident or prominent than others, right? So for cognitive, you might have racing thoughts or intrusive thoughts, difficulty concentrating, or catastrophizing, which is a cognitive, one of the cognitive distortions, which we'll soon talk about. Or emotional, maybe more chronic irritability, emotional numbness, low grade or persistent anxiety. Again, the feeling of being on edge or this discomfort, or, your heart, your chest feels uncomfortable or tight. Behavioral can look like overworking or overgiving, overcompensating in general, maybe people pleasing, or withdrawal and avoidance. And somatic can be tension, such as headaches or digestive disruption or chronic muscle tightness. Again, these can happen simultaneously. Some might be more strong than others, or maybe it happens in stages for your body, but it's so important to identify these so that you can do something about it if your body is working too hard. Okay. We all deserve a soft life. um, and I also wanted to say too, before I move on, that this list is, of course, is not exhaustive. If there are signs that you are experiencing or have experienced and you're not really sure where this falls into how you are navigating your life, your world, please feel free to reach out to us at One Piece Therapy. We'll be more than happy to process and explore what your burnout looks like, what your survival mode looks like, and how your body's communicating to you, so that we can support you to get to that stage of healing and groundedness and rest. So if you already don't understand burnout, let's understand it a bit more. And this will be a bit quicker because, we have already gone into quite in-depth biology of burnout. However, awareness limits symptoms. So the more we become aware, the more we can support the symptoms that start to appear before things become chronic. Right? Because as if you remember, even an acute response is already enough than needing to go into the chronic response of stress. So it's important to note that burnout is not laziness. It's not a lack of discipline. It is, however, a biological outcome of chronic stress without sufficient recovery. Okay. When we're used to a state of burnout or a certain level of activation with our sympathetic nervous system, this can be what we call high functioning burnout, right? And an example of this is a client who performs well at work but feels emotionally empty at home, right? And this hidden pattern is shown in this nice display here, mask on, mask off, right? So the person with high functioning burnout may appear capable, productive, and composed while feeling utterly empty and beneath the surface. So the absence of visible collapse does not mean the system is okay, as performance is not wellness, right? It's the body actually in the parasympathetic nervous system that indicates the system is okay and burnout is not present, right? So this high functioning nature comes from the familiarity of being in this state, and therefore you're familiar with operating from this level of intensity. But again, the performance is not wellness. It's important to get back into your body and understand what is actually going on, because all of these moving pieces is not necessary for living, right? But it is included in being in a chronic survival mode state, ultimately burning out. So, all that said, why rest? Why does rest feel so hard? Right. And in simple terms, I put here that familiarity is different than comfort, right? We can feel that because we're used to a state of burnout, of survival mode, of just keeping it pushing, keep going, show no weakness, fear no one, hide your anger, hide your pain, hide your hurt. All these things can make it, all these messages, I should say, could make it challenging to rest. because now these messages have become part of our identity and like our mantra as a way of living. But I like to differentiate that familiarity is different than comfort, because we can be familiar with this state of being, but that's not to say that our body is actually comfortable in that state of being, right? Which is why it was important for me to really emphasize the biology behind these states of living, because the body is not comfortable if it's in fight or flight mode, right? Quite directly in its definition, the body is comfortable when the parasympathetic system is activated. So if your parasympathetic nervous system is not activated, it's not taking the lead, it will be challenging. But it's also challenging if your body is not used to the parasympathetic taking the lead. So understanding the biology is very important. And I do want to get more into the practicality to really just highlight how it can appear in our lives. Okay. And then we'll talk about how or what we can do about it. But do know ultimately that is to say, rest feels so hard because it is, depending on the state that we're used to navigating our worlds in. So just to emphasize this a bit more, or reinforce, I should say, if your nervous system baseline is sympathetic activation, stillness can feel threatening and not restorative, right? The system has learned that movement equals safety and stillness equals vulnerability. So some common phrases I've heard clients say across time is, if I stop, everything will fall apart, or rest is lazy, I don't deserve it yet, if at all, or I have to earn a break, right? And what is great to use against these internalized messages, or really to understand what you're actually saying to yourself. For example, that if I stop, everything will fall apart. So this is taking over responsibility, right? Taking on what isn't yours to carry. If it's work, the whole company, even if it is yours, not every moving piece is your responsibility, right? Rest being lazy. So this all or nothing thinking, rest as a reward and not a need. This is another cognitive distortion that does not take into account our individual needs that our body is signaling to us, right? Also, I have to earn a break. So this personalization, equating worth with output and productivity, right? So now it's almost like, I know it's the era of AI, but we also have to acknowledge that we are humans. We have biology flowing in and around us, and it's so important to understand what productivity actually means, and that it doesn't equate to our achievements, right, or our outputs. So ultimately, these are not truths. They are cognitive distortions shaped by our nervous system trained to survive. And they can be gently and compassionately challenged, okay, which we will, again, get into in a little bit. So according to EFT, suppressing primary emotions doesn't dissolve them. It drives them underground, right? So suppressing them, putting them under the rug, which increases physiological and emotional load over time, i.e., leading to burnout or chronic survival mode state. So it's important to note here that emotions are data and not directive. So feeling something does not mean that you must act on it, but it does deserve acknowledgement because it gives important signals for what to do. If we're able to identify that we're experiencing fear in a situation, instead of our body continuously being in a negative feedback loop of fear existing all the time, we need to acknowledge it from its source to say, okay, when I'm in this environment, I feel fearful. And therefore, you're able to work around what does your body actually need, right? And maybe it's a big change such as quitting the job. Maybe it's a big change such as moving. Maybe it's a big change such as leaving a relationship. However, it's important to know that, again, emotions are data. So we do need them to understand how to navigate our world and limit the complete feedback loop of burnout and existing in survival mode. Okay. So some reflective questions I encourage you to do are to ask yourself, what emotion or emotions do I avoid most? Is it fear, sadness, anger, shame? And what do you tell yourself about that emotion? Right? Because again, a lot of how we respond to something increases the state to which we stay in versus what triggered that emotional response in the first place. So here's the window of tolerance, which is where we love to be when we're talking about the nervous system. The window of tolerance was introduced by Dan Siegel, and he describes this as the optimal arousal zone. So where the nervous system can process experience without becoming overwhelmed or shut down. So your sweet spot, your comfort zone, window of tolerance. There's so many words to describe it, but they all go towards that feeling of safety or balance. So in hyper arousal, the body is in panic, it's in rage, it's overwhelmed, it's the fight or flight. Okay. Hypoarousal, it has two different dips here, right? Because as I mentioned with the parasympathetic nervous system, that could be seen more as a hypoarousal state, as there is more relaxation when you're just, touching on it. So this is the calm and the present and engaged feeling. If you're too deep, right, now your body is shutting down, right? The dorsal is being activated, the dorsal vagal is being activated. So this is more of that freeze response, which can also coexist with depression, tends to happen in this state as well. Or as the window of tolerance, again, it's the optimal processing, the connection, the regulation. I love this illustration because it shows an up and down. So even though there's two extremes of the up and down, even in our window of tolerance, our optimal zone, we can still go up and down. But we're still in that level of balance, in our baseline and in our safety. So burnout, the pattern tends to happen when we're oscillating between the hyper functioning highs and the lows, right? So we're rarely resting in the window of tolerance, but we're either fight or flight activated, anxiety is high, or hypoarousal, we're shutting down, we're freezing, collapsing, and depression is present, right? So those extreme states can be a lot for the body to continuously be overly activating, over responding, over adapting in. It's important to note too that when we are also oscillating between these two states for a long chronic period of time, our optimal arousal window, our optimal arousal zone shortens, right? So the less time we spend in our comfort zone, the shorter it is, and therefore the easier it is to go back into the survival mode responses. The more time we spend in our window of tolerance, our comfort zone, our optimal arousal zone, is the more it can expand, and therefore the trigger of hyper or hypoarousal, it will take much more for the body to get there, which is ultimately what we want, right? The clinical goal here when we're we're talking about the nervous system and clients, with clients, and the window of tolerance is regulation and not elimination. So the aim is not a stress-free life. I know I said soft life. A soft life comes with responsibilities, and that alone can be stressful sometimes. But the regulation is more about creating a wider, more resilient window, right? And that's, again, allowing yourself to have access to spending more time in this window. So here's also another reason why stress can feel hard. So many survival strategies we carry were not learned in our own lifetimes. Right? As I mentioned, a lot of our parents are immigrants, and they have their parents, every, generations. So they could be inherited, the strategies that we're using, as much as their biology. Therefore, nurture is what we were talking about. It's also nature. So some things can be passed down through generations, who at the time needed them to endure real and pervasive danger. It's important that we honor the resilience that carried previous generations while recognizing that some survival strategies may no longer serve current safety needs. Right? So, for example, with the historical survival strategies, so stoicism, hypervigilance, and self-reliance were rational adaptations to real threats, and they worked. At the time of slavery, for example, which is a enormous historical event, stoicism was seen as you needed to be strong to endure the pain that was caused, right? And it worked for a lot of our ancestors in order to get through and have us be where we are today, right? But that was for that period of time due to the context and not necessarily how we are now blessed with the privilege because of what our ancestors fought for to reinforce that level of being. Because again, it's not natural for our bodies to hide the pain that it feels for a long period of time. Also, the intergenerational transmission of coping. So, the nervous system patterns, attachment styles, and coping beliefs are also transmitted implicitly, sometimes directly, depending on what you observe as well. And this happens across generations through behaviors and relationships. I often talk about the attachment style in my support with clients because we tend to underestimate how much our childhood relationships influence how we connect to others and ourselves in present day, right? So really being mindful of those relationships around us, and from time past. And lastly, for this slide, seeing strength as protection. So within the BIPOC community, there's a common element or common theme, expectation that never showing weakness, right, is seen as strength. And it was, and sometimes still is, a genuine form of protection. But this must be honored before it is reimaged, right? Context is everything, right? There's sometimes you do have to protect yourself, and for that is don't show your weakness, don't show all your cards. But again, the emphasis of what makes burnout and survival mode, or chronic survival mode, is the longevity to which you stay in that state of being. Right? So really being mindful of how you're navigating your stress levels, is crucial to what is reinforced. Okay, and now coming to the point of integration and reflection with all things that we shared today. So when integrating, it is important to know that, it's important to know what is needed before you apply the behavior to care for it. Okay, so a lot of, there's a lot of things that I mentioned before we can be, so familiar of, like, go meditate and stretch and yoga, read a book, which are, I don't mean to say it passively. They're definitely beautiful techniques that can create profound change. If we're not applying it to what is actually needed, then it won't necessarily be effective in healing our burnout and survival mode. Also, disclaimer before I continue, and I might forget, it takes time to recover from burnout or being in chronic survival mode. It's not just a one webinar or one technique and you do it once, twice, maybe even 10 times and you're good to go. But if something is chronic, even such as PTSD, it does take time to heal the system back to feeling okay. It can activate the parasympathetic nervous system because safety exists. It can go into the window of tolerance because balance is okay. Rest is okay to achieve and reach for in this moment. So it does take time to integrate, which is why I also want to include some reflection pieces as well. And also a perfect way to share that we have a lot of practitioners at One Piece Therapy that would be happy to help you integrate your healing journey with your lifestyle ultimately, right? That it doesn't have to be separate, it doesn't have to be compartmentalized. We don't have to prize the struggle as a badge of honor, but we can honor our bodies for the fact that they've already gone through so much and have done so much for us to continue to be where we are today. So the nervous system regulation. In general, bottom up is a great option to take in healing. So the bottom up, as you see here, it's using physical sensations and bodily interventions to calm the nervous system and the brain, versus top down is more mind first. So you're using cognitive processes, logic, and reframing to influence emotions and the body state. Of course, you can use both depending on the context, depending on your need, depending on various factors. I say bottom up because it's our body that is experiencing this over adaptation. And again, sometimes our mind is not there to really catch up to how to make sense of it, how to change things around. And also EFT is more of a bottom-up approach, which I greatly appreciate because our body already tells us so much and we can use it in a way that our minds can't necessarily comprehend, but our bodies respond to it immediately. So for example, I put a couple of bottom-up tools such as slow exhale breathing. So a longer exhale than an inhale. And a great example of that is 678. We do have a video on our YouTube channel that goes through various forms of meditational breathing and deep breathing. And the 678 is where you inhale through your nose for 6 counts. You hold your breath for 7 counts, and then you release slowly through your mouth for 8 counts. Okay? Really activating the body's awareness of safety and calmness and relaxation, right? So extended exhales, it stimulates the vagus nerve, which ultimately, again, increases our parasympathetic tone. Another example of a bottom-up tool is the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 in that order specifically. And I know sometimes it's hard to know what exactly is for 5 or for 4. Whatever you decide, whatever happens in that moment is okay. The main thing is from that approach of 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Ultimately, starting with seeing, ending with taste. So when you are able to do that, it helps your body orient to the present tense of, okay, now, you've been in this chronic state of repeating a feedback loop from a trigger that happened 5 years ago, maybe even last month or last week. Um, Allowing your body to use all of its senses will help it ground into the present, because now you'll see like, oh, I'm no longer in that classroom. I'm no longer in that meeting room. I'm no longer in that relationship, for example, or with that person. Another example is a gentle bilateral movement, such as walking or tapping or swaying. So nothing rigorous like a workout, but just simple, soft movements can also help the body to feel that there is a level of freedom and not restriction, right? Like similar to a hamster on its wheel. It might feel restricted, like it's only on this one wheel, right? But once it is able to maybe stretch an arm, I don't know if it can, but once it's able to slow down, ultimately it helps. And tapping is a great technique as well. Okay, so this is more CBT based, so top down, right? So an old narrative can say, that I can't stop, everything depends on me. So this statement reflects a fixed all or nothing mindset, often leading to burnout and anxiety. And this is very common in survival mode cognition. So instead, try the new perspective, which states, what would happen if I reduce my effort by 5%? All right, so this question reframes the situation, introducing curiosity and flexibility, and also encouraging a small but manageable change, and test the assumption that everything, right, everything will fail if effort is slightly reduced. So this promotes a shift from all or nothing to incremental adjustments. Right. So really thinking about where you find your burnout is most activated from, and seeing how you can make this incremental adjustment. Right? Some other behavioral experiments are, for instance, taking a 5-minute break every hour. Right. I know sometimes for those that deal with maybe dry eyes or eyes irritability in general, I think it's every 30 minutes you look away for 10 seconds. But just those small breaks for your system to have a breath in the window of tolerance. Right. So yes, a 5-minute break every hour, or dedicate 15 minutes after work to do nothing, right? That could be sitting in your car, sitting at the bus stop, sitting at your desk, or sitting in the washroom, just doing nothing. Then observe the outcomes. Did your performance suffer? Do you feel more refreshed? And other questions alike. So these tests provide real world data to challenge the I can't stop narrative, because you can. You very much so can stop, and it's in your best interest to stop. So your body can be able to reset, right? And across time, the more you do this incrementally, your body will learn how to stay in the window of tolerance, and that it feels okay. It actually feels good. and you'll see the benefit of it, and on the flip side of what rest can do and what that level of productivity can do. So ultimately redefining rest. Okay. This is also important to begin to integrate, because rest is regulation and not productivity avoidance, such as scrolling. I know a lot of us scroll, the passing, doom scrolling, just kind of zoning out, the mind doesn't need to do anything, even though it's consuming all of what you see. The simple action is not really elaborate in what is needed. However, we do need to differentiate and go towards the active restoration. So, all about the nervous system settling. So, some examples of still resting, even if you prefer passively, is listening to music with your eyes closed, right? Taking a shower, walking in nature, stretching. Um, Okay, someone asked what mindful shower is. So mindful shower is, sometimes we can get in the shower, we're thinking about all the things in the world, what we didn't say, what we said, what we need to do, what we couldn't do, what we will, all the things. Mindful shower is paying attention to being in the shower, paying attention to the water on your hair, on your hands, on your body, but really engaging in the activity of, washing and cleaning or cleansing your body. That also helps with the body recognizing that this is now a period of rest for you. Okay. I know that's also in cultures, at least in the Jamaican culture, or at least in my household, I could say, I think in Jamaican culture, but definitely my mom would often encourage, if I was stressed or overwhelmed, she'd be like, go take a shower. Right. And I was always so annoyed when she would tell me that when I was younger, but I get it. I get it now, and it feels really good. It feels really good. So that would be an example of mindful shower. Also, setting boundaries, right? This is huge when it comes to regulation. So the sympathetic nervous system can be activated, all these things to do. It's in fight or flight, it's going, 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 going. After setting a boundary, it reduces the activation. So there is more of that peace or balance at minimum. All right. So an example of how to set a boundary is saying, I can't commit to that this week, but I appreciate you thinking of me. Right. So this could be in a context of someone asking for a favor or work, putting more on your plate, which has also been something that, is being spoken about a lot, is, how much Black people are often overworked in the workplace for giving all these extra tasks and responsibilities. And because we know, we feel, we think, we believe that we have to work harder to be where we are, we might take on more than our bodies are actually okay with. So it can be quite easy to not set a boundary when we're trying to achieve a goal. But again, that leads to burnout, that leads to chronic survival mode. So it's important to set boundaries. They might look different, depending on who you're talking to and the context, but it's still very, very important. It's also important to know that guilt can appear, but that more so represents the nervous system discomfort of, oh, wait, she's slowing down. Like we're used to da 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 da. And that being used to something, being familiar with something doesn't mean you're comfortable with it. So welcome the guilt. It doesn't mean you failed. It means you're shifting the pattern of your body, which is needed. Also, processing emotions safely. So here are some questions you can think about. I do encourage you to, return your attention to breathing if this becomes a bit more triggering for you. However, it's so important to ask yourself, how are you feeling? Not what do I have to do today, tomorrow, yesterday, next week, and next month. But how are you feeling? Right? And what does this feeling need? And if this feeling could speak, what would it say? I know this is, again, hard to do on your own sometimes, but if you can, I encourage it. If not verbal, then in writing. Or if it's very challenging for you, please feel free to reach out to us at One Piece Therapy. We're more than happy to support you with your introspection, with your integration, and all you need to begin to become familiar with your parasympathetic nervous system taking the lead. Okay. Or at least being welcomed at minimum. And here is another model too that's also helpful when we're, changing our state from chronic to acute to rest, is doing things in micro doses, right? So for example, 3 minutes of diaphragmatic breathing, which is deep breathing, as the illustration shows, her hand is on her belly. So chest breathing can reinforce panic sometimes, especially if it's usually your chest or your heart rate that is prominent in these states. Then activating the diaphragm, so your belly, the deeper sense of breathing naturally engages the parasympathetic, right? Especially across time, it becomes more familiar and more wider in its state. Or 3 minutes of stretching. This can be freehand stretching. This can be a certain type of yoga where you do a stretch and like you pause for a bit longer than just, the strengthening ones. So stretching in whichever way feels appropriate for your body, or 3 minutes of silence before transitions, right? Maybe since we're almost finished this webinar today, when you're done, you just take 3 minutes of silence before doing anything else, right? And yes, you can do all of these three things in sequence, or you choose one thing to do for 3 minutes and then you transition or you do something else. Also using self-compassion as regulation. So this as in self-compassion significantly reduces cortisol and increases oxytocin within yourself, right? So the love hormone. So an example of this, this is hard, being mindful of that. Many people struggle with this, so that comfort, that reassurance, you're not isolated, you're not the only one. To self-kindness, i.e. self-compassion, I'm allowed to respond gently. This is based on Kristen Neff's model, who I often recommend all of my clients that need more support with self-compassion to visit her website, as she has a lot of different tools that can help you to navigate building the language, the familiarity, the comfort of self-compassion. And the reflection piece. So here are some questions as well to continue the journey of changing your state of being, right? Where do I notice survival mode most? What would 5% more of rest look like this week, even today, depending on what state you're in? And what belief about strength am I ready to challenge? Right, so deep questions, but I definitely encourage you to take moments to reflect on them. Because again, another word I didn't actually use is autopilot. So when we're in autopilot, we're not giving ourselves that chance to pause and reflect or reframe, redirect, reset in general. So please do take that time. And I know you already have, since you're here today or watching this webinar, especially up to this point, you've taken that time. And I encourage you to continue to give space as you allow it. So now we're nearing the end, and just to summarize everything, because I know I said a lot, survival mode is adaptive and not defective. Burnout is biological and not moral. Right? So there's nothing wrong with you. Rest is regulation, and therefore it is productive. And small shifts create nervous system change. Right? I know it can feel overwhelming, which is why incrementally doing new things helps. Okay. Thank you all so much for taking the time to tune into your wellness, for spending time to learn about yourself biologically, neurologically, and holistically at large. I know there was a lot of things said today. So if you do have any questions, comments, concerns, or will simply like to begin your healing journey of navigating your burnout or survival mode or coping mechanisms, our information is here. Please feel free to reach out to us, whether again, it's to continue the conversation or to start your journey. You can book with us today, and definitely follow us on Instagram, on social media, as we have our webinars every month that discuss different parts of your wellness. Okay. Thank you again so much, all of you, for being here with me today. Have a lovely rest of your Black History Month and day and week, even. And we'll talk soon. Take care.